Hey guys, this is Paige Medlin. My presentation's over cognitive behavior therapy this week, and this is more of a therapy style than I guess you would say a technical theory. So I wanted to start off by giving a few quotes that I thought would go with this type of therapy. There's 3 that I found that I really liked. The first one says, whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. Henry Ford. There's a major focus in cognitive behavior therapy on how your thoughts and actions can predetermine your success with different areas. The next one says, I think, therefore I am, which is Rene Descartes. And if anyone knows the historical background of this quote from Rene Descartes, you'll know that actually he was talking about something completely different, but taken out of context like it so often is. I thought that this really fit in with cognitive behavior therapy because in this therapy we're assuming that our thoughts become our behaviors and our behaviors become our outlook. And then the last one is the happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts. So in other words, the better quality thoughts you have, the better of a quality of life that you'll have. So now I'm going to go into what exactly is cognitive behavior therapy. And for the sake of brevity and clarity, I'm going to be calling cognitive behavior therapy CBT for the remainder of the presentation. So in looking through the book and looking through different websites and whatnot that try to explain what CBT is, they all kind of start out differently with how they explain it, but in my opinion, the easiest way for me to understand it is that cognitive behavior therapy is an extension of behavior therapy that combines psychoanalytic properties. So with behavior therapy, it was very medical and clinical, and there wasn't a big focus on feelings, and also there was not that same I-thou relationship that you see in some of the other theories that we've studied. And it took parts of that, but then it combined it with the more psychoanalytic properties that we're more used to from the previous presentations throughout this semester, where there is more of a focus on thoughts and feelings, and the I-thou relationship is there. And in fact, in cognitive behavior therapy, there's actually more of a partnership than even most other psychoanalytic-based theories. So with that being said, there's also a lot of crossovers with reality theory, in that CBT focuses in on the here and now and things that are absolutely within the client's control, and doesn't really focus on things like the cause of mental illness or the irrelevant symptoms of mental illness. And it's focusing on the thoughts and actions, again, that the client has 100% control over, rather than just their feelings, which can be an objective and not as concrete to work with. And then ultimately, CBT works by identifying thought patterns that lead to unwanted behaviors and changing them purposefully over time. And then also this has a clear and defined end, since the client and the therapist are working together to identify what those unwanted behaviors are or unwanted consequences of behaviors. And as soon as they have reached a point where they think that those have been extinguished, then therapy can be ended. In order to dig deeper into cognitive behavior therapy, I think we first need to look at the history of CBT and kind of what was going on that made it relevant and needed. So first we had Albert Ellis. This takes place in 1950s America, and he is kind of the first person who really started practicing anything that could be CBT related. And he really started with something that was closely related to, but called rational emotive behavior therapy. It predates CBT, but it also provided the basics on which CBT would be built upon. And with this, he provided the ABC model of behavior that really is kind of the basis of all CBT therapy. His style was most like that of reality theory, again, focusing on the here and now, and only the relative symptoms that the client was 100% in control of. He believed that changing thoughts were what changing behaviors. However, he still had a little bit of the idea that the therapist is above the patient and is the expert, although the patient is still a major part of what he was trying to do. After Albert Ellis came Aaron Beck. So Aaron Beck was also an American. However, he started in psychoanalytic theory rather than kind of the REBT or even reality theory that it seemed like Ellis's work was mainly in. And then Beck really mainly worked with depressed clients in the 1960s. And he had noticed that during therapy sessions, his clients were not telling him or sharing with him every single thought that he had. And he really believed that these thoughts were what was causing them to act and react to things in certain ways that were not in their best interest, kind of causing the depression in his mind and also reinforcing the depressive thoughts. And he thought that if they would be more open with their thoughts, that they would be able to look at how to change their thoughts and then in time change the behaviors and behavior consequences that were less than desirable in their life, therefore kind of overcoming their mental illness. And he really focused on the idea that the therapist and the client are entering a partnership in which one is not lording over the other, and they're both kind of in this together, and both perspectives are important. No one is the expert, and no one is above the other one. And then for a historical context, in the 1960s America, we were going through the space race, the civil rights movement, and the Vietnam War. People had begun to see the limitations of both behavior therapy and psychodynamic therapy. The clinical was not cutting it, but neither was the feeling-based therapy because the needs of clients were changing within the world. This is kind of the first time where we see that we're looking at a very first world country. America is beginning to look like it will even to this day. And the clients weren't dealing with Maslow issues anymore. So no longer do we see someone who doesn't feel like they're self-actualized. They just cannot, they have everything that they need. However, they're still unhappy with the world. So CBT kind of sought out a way that we could remedy this. So thinking back on how cognitive behavior therapy is different from other therapies, I think it's really easy to see a lot of the differences between the different theories or therapies, except for I personally struggled with seeing the difference between cognitive behavior and behavior therapy. So that's why I've kind of included this visual here, where it says that cognitive therapy focuses on identifying and changing the distorted thinking that maintains the condition, which is to say, looking at the thought process that causes behaviors, rather than the behaviors themselves, where behavior therapy provides strategies and skills to modify behavior like desensitization. And then, in my opinion, behavior therapy built the house where it's a place that we can live in, and it's a place that we can think about how behavior affects mental health. However, cognitive behavior therapy really made a home it brought in all of the finishing touches and kind of looked at the overall picture instead of just the bare bones and walls. Now I want to jump into kind of the technical parts of cognitive behavior therapy. So we've really set the stage for the development of CBT with talking about the founders, talking about the historical context and what was going on in the world. And then we've also compared it to different theories and how they worked. So now I'd like to really get into the meat and potatoes of exactly how CBT works and operates. So talking about the key terms and concepts to really understand CBT, the first thing that I think is important to understand is automatic thoughts. So Beck believed that automatic thoughts were the gut reactions to life events brought on by prolonged thought patterns, and these could either be positive or negative depending on how that person was brought up, how they experienced life, and what thought patterns had served them in the past. This was based on their cognitive triad, which was his belief that everyone had 3 core beliefs within themselves, and these were beliefs about themselves, beliefs about the world, and then beliefs about the future. Again, the cognitive triad could be either positive or negative, although in CBT we're obviously looking at those who have disruptions in their automatic thoughts, their thought patterns, and their cognitive triad, to where these have become negative thoughts only about themselves, the world, and the future. So with that being said, he said that cognitive distortions were what was causing hurting in clients. And he looked at 6 different ones that he felt were what caused human suffering. So the first one is arbitrary interference. Arbitrary interference is whenever a client is drawing conclusions about the events in their life based on... Arbitrary interference is whenever the client is making assumptions about one of the parts of the cognitive triad based on kind of completely irrelevant and insufficient thoughts about the way that the world works. So these are going to be kind of, in my opinion, the most distorted. So it's kind of that non sequitur way of thinking where it's like, something bad happened to me, therefore I am helpless, I'm worthless, everything bad is going to happen to me for the rest of my life. Then we have selective abstraction, and selective abstraction is whenever a client only sees one part of an issue and not the whole picture, and chooses to base their cognitive triad off of just one part of a situation. So in this case, they're not looking at their only part of a whole. Not everything revolves around them, and that even if they did everything perfectly, things could still go wrong based on the actions of others. Magnification is whenever a client is taking things and kind of making a mountain out of a molehill. Things that are really kind of small potatoes tend to set clients off that struggle with magnification. So a tiny thing happens, like maybe your plans weren't canceled, they were just changed, but that means that everything's wrong, nothing goes right, and you are not worthy of people keeping plans and kind of thinking like that. Minimization is whenever clients are kind of underplaying or not seeing the good in a situation. So, for example, if a client who normally has issues with their father finally tells them that they're proud of them, the client says, oh, well, whatever, he's just saying that to make me happy, and not really looking at the importance of what actually is occurring. Overgeneralization is whenever something occurs just once or twice, but you begin to think that it is the rule for how things will go. So even though you always have things happen a certain way because it changed and was negative one time, it's going to be negative now until forever. And then finally, the last cognitive distortion is personalization. This is what I like to think of as kind of taking things out of context. So just because things are happening means that it's related to you. All the bad is somehow in some way coming back because of your disruptions in the cognitive triad. If someone's mad, they have to be mad at you. It's not possible that they're mad at other people, etc. And then I'm also going to talk to you guys about behavior pathways a little bit later on. This wasn't founded by Beck, but I think it's really interesting and important way to look at cognitive behavior theory through that kind of ABC model that Ellis proposed. And then finally, the last real, key term and concept for CBT would be called collaborative empiricism. And this was an idea that Beck presented, that the therapist and the client are in a partnership. No one is above the other one, and they're really working together for the good of the client. When I started this presentation, I said that CBT works by identifying thought patterns that lead to unwanted behaviors and behavior consequences and changing them purposefully over time. So a major thing to think about is, how does a thought pattern become disturbed to begin with? So there's a couple different theories on this. And the first is that in our lives, if we experience trauma, if we experience even things that aren't traumatic but are negative, if things just don't always seem to go right with us, we are going to have disturbed thought processes. Also, someone who's experiencing any kind of mental illness could have a disturbance in their thought processing and thought patternings. And then finally, reinforcement of behaviors and thoughts over time. So kind of thinking about what happens after I have a negative thought or a negative action. And how does that serve me, can cause a thought pattern to become disturbed over time. CBT doesn't really focus on the idea that you are your illness or you are traumatized and there's no way out. It really focuses on changing those thoughts that are behind behaviors, with the idea that thoughts create feelings, feelings create behavior, and behavior reinforces thoughts. Going back to that ABC model of behavior that Ellis proposed and really brought to the forefront of psychology for the time, a simple explanation of the way that ABC works, A stands for the antecedent or activating event, B stands for behavior, and C stands for consequence. So his big deal was that an antecedent that takes place in a person's life, which is the event that they're currently going through, causes them to react in a certain way, which is their behavior. And then this behavior translates into some kind of consequence. And then I have provided you guys with a chart that I think is kind of different than what you would normally see, because it's actually based in education rather than psychology. And it's called the completing behaviors pathway. So this kind of goes a little bit deeper than just the ABC model that Ellis proposed, but it really kind of incorporates all CBT elements. So in looking at the middle straight line part of the chart on the competing pathways, you see the setting events. So the setting events are everything that has happened in a person's life and their negative automatic thoughts that are just kind of the ways that they think, the ways that they operate. And then a triggering antecedent happens. So this is the here and now event that has kind of set this person off. So based on the setting events for this person and what their automatic thoughts are, we see the problem thinking and the problem behavior. And then that translates into a maintaining consequence that is either going to act to reinforce the behavior or further the setting events for the person in that they are continuing this set of automatic negative thoughts. So cognitive behavior therapy kind of looks at it as we can support this behavior issue by teaching strategies in the thoughts after the triggering antecedent. And so we're really looking at the alternate paths that are above and below the problem behavior on the competing pathways chart. So of course, on top, we have a desired response, and that would create a maintaining consequence for the person. However, in therapy, we're looking at acceptable alternatives to the problem behavior, and that causes maintaining consequences as well. So to make this a little bit clearer than mud, I will give an example of a person who is going through a divorce. So the setting events in this person's life is that they have created negative automatic thoughts by going through this divorce with their husband, and they feel like they're worthless, they feel very lonely, very isolated, and like nothing they do is right. And then a triggering antecedent may be something for them like a friend cancels plans. So when they're in their automatic thoughts, they may automatically go to, well, I'm not good enough to have friends, and no one likes me, and this is why my husband left me. And it's causing their problem behavior of self-isolation. And then through that self-isolation, they're receiving a maintaining consequence where they are further isolated. They have less opportunities to interact with other people, and that just kind of reinforces their idea that they're not worthy enough. So the next time, whenever the same triggering antecedent happens, they're going to react in the same way. However, cognitive behavior therapy looks at what alternatives that she could have to self-isolation. So in this, after going through therapy, she may have the same setting events and the same triggering antecedent of having a friend cancel plans, but instead, she's trying to do things that they've talked about in therapy, such as finding someone else to hang out with, calling a friend, finding something that she enjoys on her own, and these are the acceptable alternatives. And then that's going to cause the maintaining consequence to change from reinforcing that automatic negative thoughts to now you're reinforcing the more healthy thoughts of, well, maybe everyone doesn't hate me. Maybe that person's just busy, and people still enjoy me even though this one particular thing did not pan out. And then over time, it'll get to the point to where whenever we have the triggering antecedent, we're getting that desired response of making alternative plans and finding things that we enjoy rather than just shutting down and self-isolating like we saw in the original problem behavior. And then that'll be maintaining a consequence by the person is feeling happier, they feel more self-actualized, and they're more in control of their life after using the techniques that were talked about in the therapy sessions. And then the very bottom of that chart is the behavior support planning. And there's a couple different places where different types of therapy would look to alternate the outcome. However, with CBT in particular, we're looking at the teaching strategies that they can employ whenever they have the triggering antecedents. So we're not looking at manipulating the past, the setting events that have really ingrained the way that they think or feel. We're not looking at changing the life events of a person, because this is not a theory that is set up for people who are kind of missing the Maslow things. It's really set up for the people who have everything but still feel incomplete. So the changing the antecedent really isn't going to do anything from them. And then we're narrowing in on the teaching strategies for whenever the behavior or thoughts that cause the behavior occur, because those are completely 100% in control of the client. And then we're also not really looking at manipulating the consequences either, because those are kind of self-evident and going to happen naturally. That leads to, why do people hurt? So CBT says that it is the thoughts and not actual events that cause people to hurt. So people may experience a traumatic event. However, it is the meaning that they place on this event with their thoughts and actions that is actually hurting them. And I think this really makes sense from a mental health perspective, especially with the mentally ill, because it is possible to have a traumatic event occur and actually grow from it and see post-traumatic growth instead of like a post-traumatic stress response. And so this is because of the meaning and the thoughts about the event that a person has. So a near-death experience could cause them to be fearful for the rest of their life, or it could cause them to be thankful for their life and live their life to the best way. It really just depends on what kind of thought patterns and automatic thoughts that the person has built up. And then also how we're reinforcing those negative thoughts. So whenever we're having negative thoughts, if we change our behavior and it reinforces a more positive outlook, over time we can see a change in those negative thoughts. And then I included the quote that if you realized how powerful your thoughts are, you would never think a negative thought. Because that kind of is reinforcing the idea that our thoughts are how our worldview is, and we would never choose to be negative on our own. If we talk about why people hurt, then we also have to talk about how people go from hurt to not hurt. So CBT says that changing our thoughts is changing our actions, and over time creates automatic positive thoughts and growth mindsets. And by doing things that work against your automatic thought processes, you are negating disrupted thought patterns. So over time, you can build up a more healthy and positive way of thinking, which in education we call growth mindset, by doing things like having positive affirmations and doing things that work against your set schema about how the world works. And I think of demand evidence and think critically. So you're not just accepting that the world is terrible, everything's wrong. You're saying, what is the reality? How can I change this? And I have to have evidence before I believe it. And really kind of taking ownership of thoughts and feelings and actions and using that ownership to kind of change everything. If people can go from hurt to not, it's important to look at how would we effectively measure that change. And CBT uses assessment, self-reporting, and therapist notes and observations to kind of create a baseline, show change over time, and then decide whenever a person is no longer hurting. It's important to think about what we mean as healed. And so in CBT, you're looking at, is the issue still existing? There's a clearly defined N. And it's important to look at the difference between asymptomatic versus cured. So a client who is a good candidate for CBT probably isn't cured at the end of the sessions. So instead, they're just asymptomatic. So they're not experiencing the issue that is in their life that caused them to go to counseling to begin with, but they're not cured. So it's important for them to be self-aware enough to really check in on themselves and know whenever they're getting bad again and go back to therapy. Which is why it's also important for the therapist to determine if the client can be asymptomatic long enough for the discontinuation of therapy before just cutting them loose. At this point, we've talked about the history, we've talked about the key terms and concepts, we've talked about why people are hurting and how that changes. But you might be thinking, what does this look like in an actual therapy session? So I'm sure that Dr. Wagner has a very excellent video of CBT in action for us to watch this week, but I will give a general overview that unfortunately is not visual. So for the first session, the client is identifying the main issue that they have in their life. So they're not identifying the event that has caused these issues. They're just saying, I have this main issue. So for example, going back to the example of a person who is going through a divorce. We're not identifying that they're going through a divorce. We already know that. We're identifying the feelings that going through a divorce is causing for them, and then the real world consequences of those thoughts and feelings. So I believe I said that they're self-isolating is their main issue, and they're feeling really lonely and worthless. So those are going to be the main issues that the counselor and the client really work on. And then after they identify what the issue actually is, they can set the goals that they want to achieve through CBT. The therapist will also actually probably establish a baseline for like how bad is this self-isolation actually is through some means of assessment, self-reporting, and observations. And then for the typical CBT session, they will have evaluated progress thus far, determine what is going to be covered in the session, have the actual session really focusing on understanding the thoughts and the feelings surrounding the issue, and the behaviors that the client is taking that causes this negative reinforcement. They're going to sum up the end of the session with a series of wins and losses, talking about what the client has done well and what they need to work on. And then there's a major focus on giving homework to work throughout the week. Since CBT so heavily looks at what the client themselves needs to actually change, it's important that they're not just focusing on the issue whenever they're in a clinical setting. If the client is not applying what they've learned, what they've talked about during a session to their everyday life, there's really no point. So the homework that the therapist would give the client is very, very important in this situation. And without it, there's really no point. And then the end of the session ends with feedback between the client and the therapist normally, talking about what was helpful, what was not, and how to move forward. Lather, rinse, repeat. You come back, you talk about evaluating progress, how did the homework go, what are the new issues that have been brought up, what's been settled, so on and so forth. And so with this model, there's a clear and defined end in that after the negative consequences and negative symptoms that the person is exhibiting are extinguished, there's really no point to continue. CBT is a really good theory, and I really feel strongly about it as someone who has actually used CBT over time. I think that it's really good for people who are experiencing these thought pattern disturbances, which are people who have trauma, who have addiction, who have any kind of pain, mental illness, phobia, general health issues, or interpersonal issues. However, I do think that there are some limitations that need to be discussed. A lot of people have criticized CBT saying it's over-regimented. and that can cause a lack of growth because the client may thrive within the clinical setting, but then once therapy is discontinued, they go back very quickly to their old thought patterns. Emotions are relevant and feelings are relevant in CBT. However, they're kind of looked at more as experiments and not realities, and that they can be manipulated and changed, and that they're not like really valid for what they are, and they're kind of glossed over. And a feeling is only relevant in its relation to a thought and behavior. It's also kind of hard to track with patients who have a multitude of symptoms. However, it can be done. It's just kind of harder. And then it makes certain assumptions about clients that they are able to change their thought processes, that they are in control of at least some of their environment and thoughts enough to make changes. And it's also assuming that they are willing to do the homework outside of the clinical setting and not just saying that they're doing it. And again, there is kind of the idea of what is asymptomatic, what is cured, and what is the likelihood of relapse. And that is why it's very important for a therapist to evaluate, even if you have reached the desired results, is there a chance that a relapse is likely? And if so, how far out? Alright guys, that's all I have for you guys on CBT. I hope you come to love it as much as I do. And in true cognitive behavior therapy, I do have a little bit of homework for you. So I want you guys to think about a thought pattern in your life that has become an automatic negative thought. So what is that one thought process that you really have that whenever this one thing happens, you always think, man, something negative? I would like to challenge you guys to try and do one thing this week that negates that thought pattern, and then tell me, what did you remind yourself about reality? So you had this negative thought, you did something that negated it, and what did you remember about the real world around you because of your negation?